Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the February installment of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series at the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I am the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement for the Wilder School. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts this free virtual event each month. And each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on the relevant topics of the day. During today's session, we ask, what is the role of transit in shaping equity for individuals and communities? Our speaker, Joe Dillard Jr., and our moderator, Dr. Nakeina Douglas-Glenn, will discuss this topic in today's Lunch and Learn titled Moving Forward Together, the Road to Transportation Equity and RVA. Before we get started, we are excited to announce our new online MPA program, which is accepting applications through May 1st. Please find more information at this link, wilder.vcu.edu/program/apply. You can find the link in the chat room. Now, a word from Dr. Susan Gooden, Dean and Professor at the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs, who will also introduce our moderator.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. Delighted to have everyone here for our Lunch and Learn this month. This is one of my favorite events from the Wilder School and an opportunity to engage so many of our alumni and friends on contemporary topics, and I know today's session will be no exception. I'm really looking forward to Mr. Dillard's presentation on transportation equity. As Stephen mentioned, a lot of exciting things going on in the Wilder School. We have our brand new MPA online program. We still have the face-to-face version for folks who are interested in that. And of course, our other graduate degrees as well. So we want to make sure that we get that information out there. Also, just want to share that one of our faculty members, Professor Jay Albanese, is receiving an Outstanding Faculty Award from the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia. This is the highest faculty recognition award that is offered in the state of Virginia, and we're very excited that our own Jay Albanese will be receiving the award next week. So there's always a lot of exciting things going on in the Wilder School, and I'm so pleased to be a part of that. It gives me a distinct pleasure to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Nakeina Douglas-Glenn. Dr. Glenn serves as Executive Director of the Gracie Harris Leadership Institute, and she is also the Interim Director of our Research Institute for Social Equity, Rise and Gully. Dr. Douglas-Glenn has been at VCU for more than 15 years and is really a well-respected thought leader in her own right relative to equity topics. Most recently, she led the vaccine equity study that the Research Institute for Social Equity did for the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as the language access study. So I know that our session today is in great hands, and I'm delighted to turn it over to Dr. Douglas-Glenn.
Thank you, Susan. I don't think it's quite often that everyone gets to say that they've been introduced by the magnificent Dean. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am delighted to join everyone here today for what I believe will be an excellent session. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing today's featured guest. I am delighted to introduce to you Joe Dillard. He is the Director of Equitable Innovation and Legislative Policy for the Greater Richmond Transit Company, known locally as GRTC Transit System. Dillard is responsible for promoting and cultivating diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the organization and in community partnerships. Joe serves as GRTC's liaison to staff, riders, and communities, guiding future initiatives with an ever-increasing focus on inclusion and equity. He is hailed as a strong champion for both employees and riders. Joe joins GRTC after serving as an Organizational Advancement Officer for Hampton Roads Transit, HRT, where he managed and directed engagement and legislative strategies to promote and accomplish the agency's mission, vision, values, goals, and objectives. Joe has been successful in securing a dedicated funding stream for transit in Greater HRT region totaling more than $31 million annually. It also secured over $25 million in various one-time state funding opportunities for public transportation in that region. Both experiences were crucial to GRTC's goal supporting and increasing public mobility for the increased needs in the RVA region. At the federal level, Joe was successful at lobbying for the inclusion of various earmarks to benefit public transportation in Southeast Virginia. Joe earned his Bachelor's of Arts degree from Norfolk State University in 2012 and has also received his Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Certificate from the University of South Florida. In 2016, he was ranked 8th on the HBCU Top 30 Under 30 list. And in 2018, he was recognized as an Inside Business Hampton Roads Top 40 Under 40 honoree. Joe has experience serving on various city, regional, and state boards and commissions. Please join me in welcoming our guest this afternoon, Joe Dillard, Jr.
Thank you, Nakeina. Welcome, everyone. My name is Joe Dillard, as she already shared. As I listened to the introduction, I couldn't believe it was me, but I'm grateful to be in this region, in Richmond. I was actually born here, and this is going to be a great discussion of talking about the need for equity in transit, especially for the Greater Richmond Transit Company. Next slide. So I'd like to start off the conversation with I will say, an icebreaker for myself. The quote that I love to use is "Remind yourself, no one is built like you. You design yourself," by Sean Carter, better known as Jay-Z. And when I say that, it always makes me bring up the question of what is your why? I want to use practical examples as we do this presentation today. And it just so happened I was talking to someone in the executive office here at GRTC today, and someone had reached out to this executive and said, "Hey, it's 8:30 and my bus isn't here. We're supposed to be here at 8:17. We got with that operator. The operator ended up making his way to that stop, but he was late. And doing so, that person that contacted the executive was at a parking ride, and they just went ahead and got in their car and they went to their workplace. What was interesting to me about that conversation that I had with the executive was that it's great to have that option, because not a lot of people have that option to get in the car, and at the same time, that's what we're going to be talking about today when we're talking about equity. Next slide. I showed a slide mostly when I got to GRTC for basic knowledge when we're talking about equity in the Richmond area. We know that Richmond is home to the Confederacy. This is our beautiful fleet. I know a question might come up from the crowd about electrification of this beautiful fleet, but I share this picture to show that I usually ask when it's more interactive what date this was. And typically you would think that it's a holiday, Christmas, or some day that we're closed where we don't operate service. However, this is a shot of our parking lot for our buses on May 30th, 2020. That's when Richmond had the Black Lives Matter protest. That's when a bus was set on fire and we discontinued service for the weekend. So this was the one in very few times, I bet you could count on your hand, in which our service was not operating due to a holiday. And when we talk about equity, and we talk about justice, we talk about equality, and we talk about transit, it's ironic that a Pulse bus was actually set on fire, which is the BRT line. And we're going to talk about a little bit about the BRT, but this picture is symbolic of the times of, and I had to think about it, of May of 2020 and what was going on in the city of Richmond. Next slide. Now we get into what I love to talk about when it comes to equity. Ridership impacts, pre-COVID trips by mode. And basically, if we pay attention to the graphic, we look on the left, 60 to 70% of our ridership has returned to pre-COVID levels for BRT. In any business, I know we look at it and say these acronyms. BRT is bus rapid transit. In a legislative world, BRT is comparable to a light rail or heavy rail. It's your more attractive system. It's the system that we have going up and down Broad Street. It's not your workhorse, but it is the future of mobility for a lot of cities and making sure that we connect the region. That ridership has returned to pre-pandemic levels of 60 to 70%. The blue line shows you where we were as far as ridership. pre-COVID. The green line is when testing became available. Gray is, I want to say post-COVID, but it's not, because COVID, I think, is here to stay. BRT is for legislative purposes and policy standpoint, is the car that you're trying to sell. The one that we're going to focus on today is the local. That's in the middle of your graph on the left. Right, as you can see, ridership has returned to pre-pandemic levels on our local bus network. And as I was sharing with some people here, I'll still say I'm fairly new to Richmond. That's not a great statistic when you say transit in the Commonwealth. That's an outstanding statistic when you're talking about ridership on a national level. Before the pandemic hit, ridership was declining across the transit industry. GRTC did a redesign. Not only have they hit pre-pandemic levels, some of those months we actually had higher ridership. Our express route is a longer form of connecting the region in a longer method, maybe a route that goes directly to Petersburg into downtown Richmond. It could be in the future a route from Goochland into Richmond, but your express route is typically, historically, as you'll see in these graphs, are your choice riders. And choice riders are those who choose to use transit, even though they have a vehicle. What's interesting about the next graph is that if you can see here, 50% of all of our BRT ridership makes under $50,000. 50% of all of our express riders make over $75,000. I think the point when we're talking about equity, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, is to point out that our local bus route or our bus system, which is our workhorse, 50%, over 50% make less than $25,000 per year. And I'm going to say that again. Our local bus system, which is the workhorse, which is a cornerstone of the recipe to increasing ridership, 50% of those riders make less than $25,000. And when you correlate that to race, that 70 to 80% of our local bus route is made up of all minorities. You have about a 50% mix on your BRT, and on your express route, 50% of your entire express route is made up of Caucasian. When you go to the right part of the graph, or the pre-COVID trips by mode by fare of transit, we're going to talk a little bit later today about the Zero Fare Transit Initiative, but you can see that our fare collections have impacted the local bus system the most. Those who need the most help, that $25,000 or less annually, are those who make the lion's share up of our fare payment. Next slide. So how does this impact our bottom line? Right here, we have Walter Watson, who's a veteran. He's trying to get on the 1C. And as we were going through these slides earlier, someone said, that's what I hate. And I'm pretty sure everyone here on this Zoom call hates it as well when you see riders out in the elements. He's trying to get to the VA. He doesn't have a landing pad underneath him. When there's this concrete that you would have near the bus stop. He doesn't have a shelter. He doesn't have a seat. There's no reliable time for him. When it comes to our system as of antiquated as that day. And what I love about Richmond when it comes to equity is Walter Watson doesn't just have to use GRTC to sell his story. His story is told through different groups like RVA Rapid Transit and their executive director, Faith Walker. She does a great job of sharing the story of the rider. And when you share that story, the equity conversation comes up. A fact that I also wanted to share was the average household spends 16 cents for every dollar on transportation. And 93% of that 16 cents goes into buying and maintaining and operating cars, which is the second largest expense after a home. You could save $10,000 per household by using public transit and having one less car. However, Walter Watson and a lot of our local bus ridership do not have that option. They make $25,000. If Walter Watson if the bus was late to Walter Watson a day and he needed to get to his VA appointment on time, the reliability will be an issue because Walter Watson doesn't have an option to use a vehicle. And I think I was going to pause, and I think Rachel wanted to weigh in. Next slide, David. And I think it was supposed to be a message. If you have any questions, make sure you add them into the chat. I love to talk about the zero fare system, and I was saying this earlier. Transit now is at a crossroads. We were talking about Netflix today, and I know some of you guys are are very, very familiar with Netflix, and they have a documentary on there called The Last Blockbuster. And Blockbuster for me coming up was the hallmark. I would go in there, pick out a video game. When they did the summer program where you could rent up to 30 days, it was awesome. But when we talk about business and the change of pace, Blockbuster is no more. And Netflix actually offered itself to Blockbuster to be purchased, and Blockbuster refused. Transit's in that same space per se. And I say that to say that ridership was declining before, as I said earlier, before COVID happened. However, COVID took timelines and a change of pace for a lot of business and sped it up. So when we say our local bus system is back to pre-COVID levels, there are only a handful of transit agencies in the entire United States or the entire world transit-wise that have local bus systems that are back to those operational levels. And I think through this creative work of the city of Richmond, their partners, Julie Tim, who's our CEO, community leaders that get up and speak out for transit, because of those initiatives, it's put GRTC at an advantage of being a leader in the forefront when it comes to transit solutions, not just for today, but to make it a viable option moving forward. So when we talk about the zero fare system, what does that mean other than free service for everyone? Zero fare means a lot. Zero fare means that that person, Walter Watson, not only gets to go to the VA, he gets to pick up his groceries. I know we have different stories of different riders that are able to pick up their children and do multiple stops in a day, which they typically had to do one-seat rides, which you guys have seen in that presentation earlier. So the accessibility for our ridership to be a part of not just society, but being meaningful to society shows that is second to none when you talk about zero ridership. Also, when you looked at the PowerPoint, and not even the PowerPoint, there were times where our local bus system, and we had this demand for essential service. There were times that showed that people that were getting on our local routes weren't just joyriders. They were essential employees trying to get to essential services to get work done. So our zero fare system was a concept that came in place, I think, nationwide for everyone when COVID was going on, because you didn't want to touch money and things of that magnitude. But Julie, Cheryl, and people, I would even say community leaders, felt like maybe we should try this as more than just a COVID-related thing, and we continued zero fares. DRPT, which is short for the Department of Rail and Public Transit, located here in Richmond, have put out a TRIP grant, and I know all these acronyms, Transit Ridership Initiative Program Grant, to help out localities or entities to do zero fare. They had an 80% step down over 3 years, so we had to find local partners. And when VCU or you guys asked me to join to talk about the equity in transit, I was overly ecstatic because VCU is one of our partners. They contribute $1.3 million of the total $8 million pot to ensure that we have free service, and the equity, the real equity, and making sure that everyone has access to reliable transportation is there. So the zero fare system it is second to none. And I had some facts about the long-term investments, because I think there's often a misconception about transit itself. But long-term investment in public transit, for every $1 billion invested, the return is 50,000 jobs, 84% less in CO2 emissions by using a subway rather than a car. The public transportation industry is a leader in clean technology. And I know we're going to talk about the future of our electrification of our fleet and goals within that magnitude, but it's very interesting of the design of not just zero fare, but the impacts that it's having. Our infrastructure bill, which is short for bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, it's $1 million in that bill, $1 billion in that bill for low-no grants, which is low or no emission vehicles, which are the electric vehicles, and that's never been heard of. Zero fare systems on the business economy, for every $10 billion invested or $10 million invested in capital into public transit, you get a $30 million return on business spending. If you go on any rail or any route of public transit within a quarter mile, 24% is the average for the increase of your home value while living near transit. So there's some definite misconceptions about the value of public transit. And I think zero fare is kind of brings it back to what I said about Netflix and blockbuster. Zero fare is going to make transit agencies operate in that magnitude of becoming Netflix or actually end up being the last blockbuster. Next slide. So what are some of the challenges that we face today? When I joined GRTC, I think in September, one of the things that alarmed me was, and I'm only using Richmond as an example, was you have 25,000 students in Richmond. Let's say 4% of those students don't make it to school because they don't have a bus driver. And that 4% is 1,000 students. So 1,000 students don't make it to school because they don't have a bus driver, or they don't get back from school because they don't have a bus driver. In any profession in the public school system, whoever's running that public school will probably have to turn in a resignation letter, and because that's just unacceptable. And that's where we were at the GRTC transit level, not just here at GRTC, but across the nation. Workforce shortages. We did not have, or we still don't have, operators to operate the service that we had on the street a year ago. So one of the things that we did at GRTC was in December do a service change. And in doing that service change, of course, it impacted the equity in our riders, but it gave you a more reliable schedule of when you know when a bus will be there. It helped our operators of not having missed trips of some trips at certain times, not just saying GRTC, weren't happening because they didn't have operators. So our workforce is a major challenge for us. And one of the other things is, and I think it's great to share, that when I came from the Hampton Roads region, we had dedicated funding stood there. Richmond simultaneously also had dedicated funding, and that money went to the Central Virginia Transit CVTA under Shet. And what that does is it brings other people into the conversation about transit. Goochland is a part of that conversation, Charles City, and how do we connect those regions to GRTC? Do we send a 40-foot bus out there? It may be, I doubt it is, but we are doing studies now to come up with some micro transit solutions. And I always try to refer to micro transit as those Uber and Lyft on-demand style services per se, where it gets you from one stop to another. Right now, with our service reduction, we don't operate after a certain time. However, if you have a job and you work later than that time, we do have a partnership with our Ubers and Lyfts now, where they can take you from the stop that you were originally going to and to where you were going. But when we talk about equity, it's a holistic conversation of making sure is simultaneously as we're making sure we're getting riders where they need to go, that we're not burning out our essential employees who are our operators to make it happen every day. And I think, next slide, I think that's all I have, and I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Joe, for a wonderful presentation. I want to go right ahead and jump into some of the questions that we have from our audience. First, one of the things that I've recognized is that GRTC is a local government-owned public service company. Can you tell our viewers how this model of ownership distinguishes GRTC from other ownership models?
Yes, certainly. So right now, GRTC is a hybrid. Of course, it's owned by 50% of the company is owned by the city of Richmond, 50% is owned by Chesterfield. And Nakeina, I think, which is a great point right now, is to say that we're going to actually have Henrico joining our board now here within the next 60 days. But it gives ownership and oversight directly to the community that it serves. One thing that I'm learning, or I have learned about Richmond, is as long as your community is engaged and they are supportive of something, when you have a public transportation company that has that city oversight, or those members of the board from the city, it gives greater accountability of listening to the voice of the people and not the bottom line. Free fare in the private sector is uncalled for. You can't do free fare because you have to hit the bottom line. However, when you have these partnerships with VCU came in with $1.3 million. The city of Richmond is contributing money on a local level to continue with zero fares. And that's just the equity and making sure that we have access to anyone that needs transit, compared to a private company that pretty much cares more about the bottom line.
Thank you for that. And a lot of the data that you've provided for us today in this conversation really drills into, or at least highlighted for me, made visible some of the equity issues. I wanted to talk about You gave us some data related to the differences between local fare users and express fare users. And is there a way to, how do we bridge that gap between thinking about those stakeholders who use local transportation just for means of accessing work or their basic needs? How do we create a culture of ridership among everyone so that they're thinking about transportation, not just for leisurely activities, but also their basic needs? And then how do we also shore up our local access?
Very good question. I think it's an industry issue, because I know you heard me earlier say that choice riders are the ones that use Express, and that's a term that we use in the industry. Also, the opposite of a choice rider is a dependent rider. And in the equity space, I know you know words matter. So to refer to someone as a dependent rider because they don't have a car, but refer to someone with a car as a choice ridership is a stigma within itself. Like I try to use, if you use choice riders, you would say car dependent. So I say car dependent instead of choice riders. And we're going to say that dependent ridership is based on having a vehicle or not. So I think it's all in not just the riders itself, but the industry and how we address it. I think it's a negative stigma for when I was in the Hampton Roads region and we heard of the zero fare in Richmond. I think everyone thinks that, oh, if it's free, it must have a whole bunch of homeless people up there. None of those people are going to work, where I think it's 71% of all of our bus riders are going to and from work or employed. 7% are students. So around 79 to 80% are either students and or employed. And we have to do a great job or a better job of changing that narrative of, just like you're saying, it's not just, okay, I'm going to the diamond to watch a baseball game, but really getting you out of that vehicle to use this for dependency on service.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from our audience. This question is from Damian Pitt. Can you tell us the status of planning for the new Pulse or BRT routes? And how do you think those new routes can be used to further equity objectives?
Well, the status right now is we just literally hired within the last 2 weeks a new director of planning and scheduling, Sam Sink. She actually came from Hampton Roads Transit with me. She did a lot of planning and things behind the light rail expansion or the light rail deal there. I think it's more realistic now than ever because there are federal dollars out there. We know the Greater Washington Partnership has done a great job of putting out a plan of what that connector would look like. From an equity lens, it all depends on where it runs. And I don't say this lightly. I think BRT expansion is greatly needed in the city of Richmond. But the BRT is also that sexy car. It's not the workhorse. The workhorse is your local routes. I think GRTC under Julie Tim, Sam Sink, and working with Joe McAndrew, I think the equity piece in that north-south corridor study is going to be a major component in our application for anything that we do at the federal level. But I would like to think that the realization of that BRT project being expanded is not only supported by or needed by the equity for riders, but the business community. If you go on Broad Street right now, a lot of that development is based on the business community's investment into that BRT project. However, Julie Tim and GRTC is going to be moving forward with some partnerships that are forced onto these larger businesses to address the equity needs of not just transit, but housing challenges, homelessness, and things of that magnitude. So we're looking to make the BRT expansion more than just a transit issue about equity, but equity in whole of housing and job access, et cetera.
You spoke about businesses. Generally, when we hear conversations about public transportation, they're usually targeted around large scale businesses, retail and dining. What impact do these initiatives have on those small businesses, small owned retail, small family owned businesses?
Definitely, that's a great question. So when you talk about economic returns, I wanted to look this up. When I'm talking to small business leaders, even larger ones, it doesn't matter. For every $1 that you invest, you have a $5 return on economic investment. Those small businesses, I know we have our manager of organizational advancement here, Ashley Mason. We had issues where small businesses have things as far as where bus stops are located. I think from a business aspect, the more they start to dial in of making it an asset to them and not a liability, is where the small business will start seeing that economic increase. I think it's still that negative stigma of these riders can't afford XYZ, and you kind of scrutinize that. So hopefully, not just after this conversation, any small business person that's listening to this, I think GRTC is poised and willing to work with anyone when it comes to not just increasing the business bottom line, but addressing equity in a arm by arm or side by side manner, just to make sure that everyone wins in that scenario.
Great, thank you. We have another question from our audience. Can you talk about whether there is any effort to work with DPW on infrastructure to give our local routes BRT-like speed? For example, floating stops so buses don't have to go in and out of traffic, or dedicated bus lines for local routes?
So I think DPW, we're talking about Department of Public Works of Richmond.
Yes.
DeRona does a great job of the multimodal transportation operation, and she works closely with Adrian here, who's our Chief Administration Officer. I think there's synergy there, where if it's possible for us to help out, we definitely are willing to do it. I know I've been working with Julie, and Julie's been working with DeRona as well to address, I thought one of the questions was going to be about bus stop and bus shelter access and things of that magnitude, of how we could partner with not just the business community, but the communities themselves to kind of design what they would look like. But I think there is some synergy and lines of communication there just to work with DPW to address some of those.
Thank you. You mentioned children and school buses earlier, and I know that GRTC has some reduced rates for students when we were in a non-zero fare time. Dr. William Fleming, he is a retired orthopedic surgeon, and he does a lot of service work here in the Greater Richmond community. He has a charitable organization. And one of the barriers that he's experienced is related to transportation for children. And so he's wondering what opportunities or has consideration been given to the needs of services for charitable organizations to transport youth to different events. How might he think differently about existing services? And could you please address just sort of when school buses and commercial transportation companies are not an option, how might GRTC, how might they consider GRTC to stand in the gap?
That's a great question from Dr. Fleming. And it's great that you asked it, because I think our hands are only tied, and I'm saying this because we never say no, are only tied by federal guidelines of when it becomes a private charter. Our furthest stop is about a quarter mile beyond any furthest stop becomes a private charter. However, right now we're trying to figure out how we can work within those boundaries to provide that type of access or that type of transportation requirement. I think Dr. Fleming, of course, you're going to share my personal information, but I think that's what my job is here to do, is kind of not say no, but create a way of how we can get to yes. So it might not be a dedicated bus every day, but if we're talking about events and trips in which we can support that doesn't violate any federal guidelines, then I think we can find some synergy there. And even if not, we do have a great, and I want to plug Vaughn here, that we have a great Ride Finders program where we do carpools, and we could strike up some partnerships where we're not talking financial benefit. We're just talking about making sure that children have the access to these options to get to certain places. The state park group reached out to us, and they want to do a bus from Richmond to Pocahontas State Park. We would love to do that, but Pocahontas State Park is outside of our service area. So in the meantime, how are we finding out or leading up and to getting to that level? Is it van pool? Is it things of that magnitude? So we're never going to be that agency that says no, and we're going to try to find a way to make sure that we can accommodate the community that we serve.
Great, thank you. Speaking of the community that we serve, and you've just sort of reached out to Dr. Fleming with your personal information or your professional contact information, but what other opportunities for community engagement exist with GRTC, and what does that look like?
That's a great question. Before COVID, I would be pinpointing, like maybe this, if you're doing a community drive. During COVID and post-COVID, I think we all can agree that public transportation is essential. and if anyone's listening here, if you have anything going on in the community, the Greater Richmond area, please consider including us. We'd rather be there or show up to support it. If it's an outing, if it's, I know me and you talked about how to ride the bus. I can come out and talk to communities and give you impossible scenarios of how the bus is. Richmond owns 50% of the bus service. Chesterfield owns 50% of the bus service. Chesterfield has one bus route. And when we talk about that type of what can we do in a community, I think I love being in Richmond because they're already community activists and people are really dialed in with transit. Whereas where I came from, it was kind of like pulling teeth, making people feel valued. But now it's just to continue to elevate that voice. If you want to, if you have anything, any event that you could think of, I would always encourage you to include GRTC. If it's not me, I know our CEO is very active and wants to be involved in community initiatives.
Thank you. This question is from, I believe, Lauren. She wanted to know, a lot of local board and decision bodies struggle with frequency and fare dilemmas. This is this discussion that a system has to decide between investing in the system and increasing frequency and reach versus removing barriers by no longer collecting fare, but not having the revenue to support it. Excuse me. What do you think about this tension and how can GRTC navigate? So I think it's this tension between, we have to increase fares in some way, we've got to increase our reach and some of the efficiencies that you talked about earlier, but sometimes that poses barriers or what we see as being equity barriers in our community. And so how is GRTC navigating this conversation?
Okay, I think I can get to that. And the great thing goes back to what you were saying about being public and not private. There's not some slush fund of $10 million where we have the authority to switch it here and decrease frequency. It's kind of an a la carte, you get what you pay for. So if they decrease the funding, it's going to decrease the frequency of the service, without a doubt. But moving forward in those tensions, I think more conversations like this. My job is to put on a tie and talk with policymakers, deal with the community, et cetera. However, you have people in the community that elevate this conversation. I said Face Walker earlier. You wouldn't have some of these conversations at the level of zero fare. You got your Wyatt Gordons, those who really weigh in on transit, that it impacts their bottom line. The conversation that we're having at GRTC now is how do we move forward with zero fares forever? We want to be able to take the fare system or the fare boxes out of the buses. However, simultaneously, when you do that for the community, we still have to take in the mental health, the impacts that it will have on our operators, et cetera. But we're looking for community partners, kind of like VCU, that are willing to step up and see that this isn't a stigma. This is actually an investment, not just on your business, but the housing market. One thing that I can guess right now, where I am right now, Southside Plaza, your life expectancy is 20 years less than a mile that way. These things are interconnected. And I think the more that we can get the business community, the community itself to coalesce behind transportation, it makes it better for these systems to connect with each other.
Right. A lot of what you're talking about is this sort of compound impact of equity. And so having equity in one area of our lives then translates into equity in other areas of our lives as well. We have another question from a guest. This is Serene. Most of our Richmond's underprivileged communities also experience severe food insecurity, part of which is limited access to grocery stores because many don't own a vehicle. Are there plans to provide special routes or special services to these communities?
That's a great question. As of today, no, but if that is a scenario or a situation, we can make it happen. Before I left the Southeast region of Virginia, we had an issue like that in one of the communities, and we provided that service on the weekend. If there's a demand there, and I would say, speaking on behalf of Julia, our CEO here, if we don't know, we can't do anything about it. But if we do, we will make an effort to. So there's no plan underway, but if you will be willing to contact me, we can definitely get that underway and make sure that we have access or provide that access directly to the grocery store.
And our guest, Nia, she'd like to go back to a point in our conversation when we were talking about private car services. And you talked about some of the boutique style services that GRTC was offering. Have any of the private car services such as Uber, Lyft harmed bus ridership? And if so, is this due to convenience? Is it due to speed, reliability, or cultural issues? Do you have a sense of that?
Right now for GRTC, no. If you talk about it with transportation network companies like those Uber or Lyfts, our biggest armor is you can't beat free. Of course, you can get your Uber Black, your back seat. And even then, we offer that Uber service late night through GRTC. The numbers aren't proving that it's impacting the transit ridership here at GRTC. And I'm not just saying your car dependent. I mean, I'm not just talking about your dependent riders, but also your car dependency. So the increases across the board, though express riders aren't riding at pre-pandemic levels, express riders are largely captured now in a telework process or driving themselves. That we're not losing our ridership right now actively to those boutique services. I think those issues come in when you talk about, and it's just on a personal level, traveling. If we left here and went to Charlotte, that's where you lose a lot of that public transit ridership. But your workhorse, which is your local route, is still going to be, well, here at GRTC. Now, that's a great question for another agency anywhere in the nation that has declining ridership. But I think we've done a great job of the redesign and pushing this free fare.
Great. Well, it looks like Josh and Doug have started a conversation as well over here. So they want to think about or talk about transportation access to our park system. And Josh specifically is thinking about, are there plans to increase service to our park systems, particularly here in Richmond? Right now, he sees a challenge to public access to those parks. And then Doug also chimed in on that conversation. When you think about our large parks like Bird, Bryan, Chimborazo, they have also low access. And so what's the discussion looking like with Parks and Rec, going back to your earlier conversation about Pocahontas Park, to get our community access to the local parks?
So we're working with Stu over at REI right now. And I think, and I'm not gonna say I think, we're working to put a marketing campaign together to encourage the local parks that are within our service area to kind of gauge the possibility or the exploration of expanding that experience or that exposure. So it's a great question by Josh. I think we've actually started that conversation and want to push some type of effort to encourage people locally to explore, to get to our parks in a holistic, or further down the road, we want to, if we have that demand and we can show that the ridership has increased because of it, we want to start those partnerships where we possibly can get a van pool and get out to somewhere like the Pocahontas State Park, where our inner city youth have not experienced something of that magnitude, but actually getting out there to that. So I think that's a conversation that's actively underway. And I think we invite anyone that wants to be a part of that as well.
I'm going to give you a few seconds to talk about clean energy and what the electrification of the fleet might look like before we sort of transition our conversation more into careers. We've got a number of students. So I do want to get into that career conversation before we disconnect. So could you just talk briefly about the electrification of the fleet?
So it's a slippery slope, because I am very pro electric vehicles. Julie Tim, who's our CEO, is pro electric vehicles. However, some of the performance of our electric fleet in the nation right now, after one charge, full charge, you get maybe 100 miles. And when you're talking about the reliability and things of that magnitude, there are questions about that. However, as I always use, the change of pace in business, that will be fixed in short order. But we're hopefully in the future, we're looking forward. And I know Cheryl Adams, who's our chief of staff, is kind of heading up this conversation of what does GRTC look forward to as far as electrification, not only of the fleet, the building, all of our support vehicles, the option to have charge and electric vehicles of employees here. And as I said earlier, in the bill itself, the bipartisan infrastructure law, you went from $200 million in no money, which is low emissions, to $1 billion. So even at the state level, when you talk about policy, we're moving to a direction where electrification is the only option. I had the pleasure of being on an electric bus before I came to the Richmond region. It was quite the sight. One of those Proterra buses. The issue is where you buy a 40-foot diesel bus, and I'm not saying that this is preventing us. That's a $450,000 bus. If you get an electric bus, it's going to cost you $1 million. The maintenance over time does negate a lot of that extra cost, but the reliability of the bus fleet right now, as it stands with the options, is what's in question. However, I will venture out to say if it's 2022, by 2025 and 2030 range, I think we have enough data back from the buses to know that as we start this BRT north-south corridor, the electric bus isn't even an option. It's an afterthought because that's the way of the future. So hopefully, my fingers are crossed that those Proterras, the Gilligs, those who create those electrified fleets, the technology kind of catches up where it becomes more reliable, where we can operate those buses.
Great, thank you. A few questions here about careers. We don't often think about connecting the ideas of careers in transportation beyond that of bus operator. And so what is being done to attract more diverse candidates into the pipeline, particularly at the K through 12 level? When we think about graduates, college graduates, how are you all messaging careers in transportation?
Very, very good question. And I don't know if I shared this with you. I started off as an intern. So as I graduated, I was an intern at Hampton Roads Transit. Right now at GRTC, we actually have interns in our planning department. I'm working with Eldon Burton over at Virginia State University to start an internship partnership pipeline to get you into the executive, not only executive C-suite offices here, but beyond the operators lens. Hopefully I can get with Virginia Union. Now, definitely will be willing to part with VCU as well. The one thing I can say is our internships aren't free. We do pay folks. Now, we don't, I can't say how much we pay, but we do pay our folks. And from a career standpoint, I think to look out for those internships. They're few and far in between, but I think from the equity lens of diversity, it's on to come up. Our agency is led by a woman. Our second in charge is led by a woman. I think it's me and one other male here at that executive level. However, the internship, I think, for the transit industry is the way in, because you have to learn if anything, you learn the acronyms, and once you get the acronyms down, they feel a lot more comfortable with you. But there is a space for that. It's also incestuous as well. I'm learning that I know how I got into transit, but it's a very small world. So if there are opportunities that anyone here has or wishes to go after, also, I keep saying contact me, let me know, and I can help connect or work that bridge or some type of concept.
Great. And are your interns just college level, their high school opportunities as well?
So right now, when we talk about the high school opportunities, I believe there was a partnership with the city of Richmond. In the summer, Richmond did, right. So we do that for the high schoolers. Right now, our interns do directly GRTC or college level.
Great. And I want to, if you haven't heard about our Wilder Fellows program, it's a great partnership with our school and public service agencies as a way to get our master's level students involved in a niche area of public service. And it's always great because those students are trained. They've got higher analytical skills. They've got that professional acumen that many employers are looking for. So there are great opportunities I see on the horizon for perhaps our Wilder Fellows program with the GRTC as well.
Definitely.
One of the things when we think about public service, we're always saying that many times individuals should live among the community that they serve. So we have this conversation, this debate a lot in education when we think about our teachers and principals, and we have it in other areas of service. What do you think about the notion of requiring transit planners, for example, or even generalists to live in the communities that they plan for? In the same way that many municipalities require that for other professionals?
I have angst. No, I don't have any angst. I think that everyone should live in the community that they serve, not just for transit professionals or in the public space. If you work at Dominion Energy and you're in downtown Richmond, you should live in Richmond to kind of understand your impact, because it's not just for planning purposes. If you live in Richmond, you should work in Richmond for it. But for transit, you should take it a step further. Like, when's the last time you've used a system? Like, how can I understand what the gentleman talked about today, being late and him having to choose his car if I haven't rode the bus system ever? And I think that's where, not just from a planner standpoint, from a transit standpoint, I'm looking myself to get into Richmond. And when I come to Richmond, it's going to be along transit access lines. But there are issues. And I also think that a lot of things can be addressed or changed based on being a part of the community that you serve.
Definitely. Can you tell us a little bit about the current state of diversity in transportation? Specifically, we're interested in the C-suite.
Yes. So I was just reading an article this morning. Florida has, I think, 11 minorities and women that are CEOs of those transit companies. So when you talk about diversity in the C-suite, here at GRTC, I think Julie has been intentional in how she hires her C-suite executives as well, because Richmond is a melting pot. And if you don't have a melting pot in your leadership, we all have a different aspect of how we bring our senior executive meetings that happen in this room, how we bring something to the conversation. There might be something of my culture that impacts the 70% of riders that have dependency on transit compared to someone else from a financial background that only understands the bottom line. So the diversity in the transit industry, public transit industry, is on the uprise. I believe, and especially for those who have master's degrees, planners coming out of school, the planners of our transit system today, a lot of them are retiring, and they're looking to hand a torch over to someone else. Now, I'm not saying that for you guys to quote me that you're going to become a director of planning right out the gate, but the space is there for you to kind of glean and get some knowledge from a lot of these great leaders, where it's not just a director of planning, it's your chief planning officers. There's so many different aspects to transit outside of making sure the operation runs smoothly, that I think is the opportunity for C-suite diversity across the board. If a transit company does not have an employee directly in the C-suite that's for DEI, I think the generation on this call now are going to be the ones that push that. Like, that's a mandatory requirement, where 15 years ago it might have not been, but there should always be a diversity, equity, inclusion space or officer at the C-suite level that can touch the CEO and let them know and moving forward. And I think it's that duty of that person to make sure that not only your C-suite is representation of your community, but your entire organization looks like the community you serve.
Great, thank you, Joe. That was really a great segue into the next phase of this. And so we are coming to the end of our time together. And so I just wanted to provide you an opportunity for any closing remarks or final thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with today.
Yes, I know you guys have a lot of participants, and I'm still trying to figure out this new communication space, because I would always tell people to meet me at the Havana 59, but now it's like I'm still trying to get my mind wrapped around COVID. So if you see me around, please stop. I'm a people person, and I say that even though I'm an introvert, I love to hear stories. I love to hear people's experience and goals. When you're passionate about something, including transit, I'm always ears. I always want to find the path, and I'm not just saying I think GRTC wants to find the path to yes before we say no. And I think us moving forward, we want to be that community partner where we're not looked at as like a social service, but actually a partner that benefits the entire community.
Great, thank you so much. And we didn't get to talk about all the leadership lessons you've learned, but for those of you who know the leadership literature, Joe pointed out two very distinct ones today: getting to yes and knowing your why. And I think that's a great, those are two great mantras for those of us who are in public service. So I want to thank you again for your time today, Joe. We really enjoyed our conversation with you, and I will turn it back over to Stephen Dozier.
Thank you again, Joe. Thank you, Nakeina, Dr. Douglas-Glenn. Thank you to Dean Gooden and our communications team working behind the scenes. We want to let you know that on March 23rd, we'll be hosting Kelly Donovan and Trisha Harper in a discussion titled Marijuana, Cannabis, Weed, Is Virginia Ready for Regulation? Also, join our Policy Bites newsletter, which is free, by emailing the Wilder School directly. And now we will have Paula Otto, Senior Director of Special Projects, share more information about the upcoming Excellence in Virginia Award ceremony, Excellence in Virginia Government Award ceremony, which is happening in April. So, Paula.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We are so excited to let everyone know that the 15th Excellence in Virginia Government Awards will be held on Tuesday, April 26th in person. We have announced our outstanding winners. We'll be honoring 7 individuals and organizations in Virginia for their significant contributions. Our honorees include our Lifetime Achievement Award winner, Florence Neal Cooper Smith, who has spent decades fighting for additional funding and education for sickle cell anemia. Our Innovation in Government Award winner is the Danville Police Department and their work with community policing. Our Hill Robinson Expansion of Freedom Award winner, the Moton Museum in Farmville. So lots of great information at this website. You can register to come and be a part of our celebration on April 26th. And we look forward to seeing you there. We're, again, thrilled to be back in person. There's the list of all of the winners. This program also raises important funding for student scholarships. We award 2 student scholarships each year as well. So we not only are recognizing these extraordinary individuals and organizations, but also creating scholarship opportunities for students. So look forward to seeing many of you there at the Marriott. And again, you can go to the Wilder School website to learn more information and to register. Thank you, Stephen.
Of course, and thank you, Paula, and we look forward to hosting everyone again next month, March 23rd at noon. We'll have a great conversation ready for you all, and thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.